economy. Last month, the out-of-stock percentage of infant formula rose to 43%. As a mom, I know that nothing can be more unsettling than wondering if your child has what they need, whether that is formula or prescription drugs or medical care. No parent should have to face that level of uncertainty. The administration has taken action to address the infant formula shortage. As we know, they have worked closely with infant formula manufacturers to increase production, expedite the importation of safe infant formula from abroad, and work with large retailers to prevent formula hoarding, as well as with federal and state law enforcement to stop price gouging and other types of predatory conduct. But to be very clear, to prevent shortages like this from happening again, we need to get to the root of the problem. And it's not just baby formula. It's many other areas, as I know we will hear today, where we have consolidation. The closure of a single company's production plant, we all know something went very wrong there, but the closure of a single company's production plant should not cause the collapse of our entire domestic supply of baby formula. But the reality is that just two companies controlled nearly 80% of infant and toddler formula sales last year. There are many things involved in that. We know that must be improved with the WIC program and other things. I get all that. But the bottom line is we're at that 80% number. So I see this as a crossroads. It's time to decide, do we want to be a country where marketplaces are dominated by a few giants and where manufacturing is so consolidated that our supply chains are at risk? It's like a game of whack-a-mole. I'm remembering back when we had the EpiPen issue. Part of that was when those prices skyrocketed. Part of that was because one of the other competitors was closed down, another one had a problem, and then suddenly if you just have a few players in the market and you're only left with one or two, guess what happens? You either have prices sky high or you have shortages. Do we want to be an economy, on the other hand, where competitive markets drive growth and innovation, where small independent businesses thrive alongside larger corporations, an economy where supply chains are resilient enough to ensure that consumers have access to essential products? I think it's an obvious choice. What is happening in the infant formula market shouldn't be a surprise. These kinds of supply crises are exactly what happens in consolidated markets. And we've seen it time and time again, as I noted, in insulin, meat supply, pharmaceuticals. We've seen increasing consolidation in markets across our economy in everything from cat food, where three companies now make up 90% of the dry cat food market, to caskets, where two companies now account for 82% of all sales. And if we don't address this problem, supply chain emergencies like this will continue to happen. We've let this crisis of concentration fester, and it's time to stop admiring the problem or complaining about it or throwing popcorn balls at CEOs who may deserve it, but why don't we just do something about it for a change? As I've said repeatedly, the future of America's success, both for families and our greater economy, depends on how we approach competition policy today. Our enforcement agencies have to have the resources to fully enforce America's antitrust laws. And I do appreciate the work that Senator Grassley and I did and others on this committee on the merger fees to be able to put some more funding that is currently in the conference committee for the USICA bill. And we plan to get that done this summer and to make sure we get some more funding there. There's also more things we can do in a budget. But we also have to look at the law. America has always rejuvenated our antitrust laws. We believe in capitalism. We believe in free markets. And when new things happen, we tend to try to respond to them. It is why I introduced the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act with Senators Leahy, Blumenthal, Booker, and many others to reinvigorate antitrust enforcement and preserve competitive markets. The bill would update the Clayton Act to stop harmful consolidation, including by shifting the legal burden to the merging parties in big mergers to prove that the transaction doesn't harm competition, if it would significantly increase market concentration or would result in a dominant firm acquiring an actual or potential competitor. The bill would also make it easier for the government to challenge abuses of market power by very large companies. I also appreciate the work Senator Lee has several bills as well. We worked on one together that just went through. And so there is much work that needs to be done ahead. These proposals would help reduce the excessive consolidation that threatens not only our economic growth, but the resiliency of our supply chains. Of course, when it comes to infant formula, we also have to consider other potential policy solutions to address the lack of competition. I mentioned the importation of safe infant formula. I actually did this with Senator Collins when we had a shortage of prescription drugs that we allowed for safe importation from other countries, and that was helpful. And I've been discussing these ideas with the administration. The Federal Trade Commission has also launched an inquiry into the causes, and I mentioned the WIC program and other things that we could do to create more resiliency in how we handle this thing, as well as clearly the inspection issue and what went on there. That is all true. And every time there's a crisis, we do find those identifiable things we can work on. But we have to at some point step back. And when we look at that, our meat producers didn't have places to bring their meat during the pandemic when one shut down. Or we look at the fact of the 90% market share that Google has right now. And what that means, as Senator Lee knows, with the way the ad market is being handled, and what that means for competitors out there simply trying to compete with the own products that these tech platforms now own all the time, what that means to Americans. Or we look at what happens with pharmaceuticals when the price shoots up because one goes out of business or buys the other one. These are real things happening right now. So while we can play whack-a-mole, and I suggest that we do because we want to make sure we're taking on each industry at a time, that cannot be the only solution. The only solution is clear. We have to make some sensible updates to our antitrust laws, as well as make sure that we are funding the enforcers whose job it is to make sure that they're enforced. And with that, I turn it over to Senator Lee. Thank you.
Begs the question whether it's whack-a-mole or whack-a-cat, which could result in cat caskets. You could merge those.
Okay, that is fascinating thought process.
Yeah. Also,
right.
I'll not go down that tangent further. Thank you, Chair Klobuchar. In my opening statement of our first subcommittee hearing on the subcommittee last year, Senator Klobuchar and I explored the broader contours of competition policy. And it was in that context that I expressed my concern that in many cases, free markets and therefore competition are distorted and undermined whenever you see government putting its thumb on the scale and doing so in a way that ends up picking winners and losers. Today, we're here to discuss an example of exactly that. The ongoing infant formula crisis is a painful reminder of what can happen, a painful reminder of the fact that the most dangerous monopoly creator in any market that it chooses to enter is the government itself. President Reagan had a famous quip that was something that seems appropriate here, where he said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, when we start looking at this in the context of infant formula, it, of course, begs the question, who would object to well-intentioned efforts to oversee the production and sale of safe, healthy baby formula? Unfortunately, as we'll hear today, those well-intentioned efforts have ended up taking on other objectives and ended up taking the form of protectionist tariffs that effectively have barred competition from foreign markets. FDA regulations surpassing those of other Western developed nations, that created barriers to entry on top of the protectionist trade policies previously mentioned, and also federally mandated sole source contracts under the WIC program that created state-by-state formula monopolies, thus exacerbating even further the current baby formula shortage. Together, these policies formed a perfect storm of sorts to drive market concentration and prevent competition. The very conditions that today mean that the closure of even a single manufacturing plant in Michigan can leave millions of American families scrambling to find ways to feed their newborn children. Recent reporting indicates the severity of this problem, showing that the out-of-stock rate for baby formula rose from just 11% in November of last year to over 73% at the end of last month, May of 2022. In response, several major retailers are now limiting formula purchases. These challenges are on top of the financial pain felt across America in the Biden economy. Gas is over $5 a gallon, and parents are having to drive cities away just to try to find food for their babies in America. Now, keep in mind that there is no natural baby food shortage. There's nothing natural about this. Other peer nations, our neighbors, or our counterparts across oceans aren't suffering this. No, this is created by our government, and it's therefore produced a shortage isolated and limited to our shores. And what's been the Biden administration's response? Well, earlier this week, the president's press secretary helplessly flipped through a binder for a total of 20 agonizing seconds when asked what the White House was going to do to help American families who couldn't find baby formula. Her response? Well, she eventually conceded after that awful 20-second hiatus. Quote, "I don't have anything new," close quote. Yep, that's the end of the quote. That's the whole thing. That was her answer. I guess that means President Biden will keep begging foreign countries for more baby formula, just the same way that he's had to beg foreign dictators for more oil. Now, sadly, because government made this mess, it'll take action by the government to fix these mistakes. And clearly, we can't depend on the Biden administration to lead the charge, given the response that we saw just in the last 48 hours. We can't count on them to do it. And that's why last month I introduced the Fixing Our Regulatory Mayhem Upsetting Little Americans, or Formula Act. One of the better titles I've ever come up with, if I may say so. The Formula Act addresses the infant formula supply chain disruption by temporarily waiving the protectionist trade barriers to importation that reduce the supply and increase the price of already available, safe, foreign-made formula. The bill would also waive some of the regulations that currently prevent the importation of safe baby formula from abroad. This would allow American families to access safe and plentiful formula that's manufactured in Europe and elsewhere during the current shortage. Finally, the bill would allow for WIC program beneficiaries, those receiving WIC vouchers, to use their vouchers to purchase formula from any producer, rather than being limited to the brand or the product listed on their specific voucher, which in many circumstances may be unavailable, thus exacerbating the nature of the shortage for them. Now, the Formula Act won't permanently fix every mistake and every risk that helped get us into this mess, but it can and certainly would provide much needed relief in the near term from the crisis as we now face it. In the meantime, Congress should get to work amending or repealing the anti-competitive trade policies and regulations that are stifling competition in any market, especially those on which we rely heavily in order to have the ability to feed our children. The Formula Act hasn't passed yet, but it's going to. It's going to because it has to. And I have yet to encounter a single substantive objection to it, a single reason not to pass it. This is a crisis, and it is a crisis that could be, and I believe soon will be, fixed by the Formula Act, which we should pass. I'm grateful for our witnesses joining us today to start that process, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Lee. Now I'm going to introduce the witnesses. A few are here and a few are remote. Barry Lynn is no stranger to this committee. He is the executive director of the Open Markets Institute, an independent nonprofit organization focused on addressing concentrations of economic power. He got his degree from Columbia University. Ginger Carney, who's with us remote, is the Director of Clinical Nutrition at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, a leading nonprofit pediatric research and treatment hospital. She earned her bachelor's degree at the University of Tennessee, her master's of public health at the University of Memphis. Scott Lincecum is the Director of General Economics of the Herbert Stifel Center for Trade Policy for the Cato Institute. Did I say your name right? Tell me. Lincecum. Oh, it was pretty good. Mine is hard too, so. Okay. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, he practiced law for nearly 20 years. He earned his BA from the University of Virginia and a JD from the UVA Law School. Jeanette Contreras is the Director of Health Policy for the National Consumers League, also with us remotely. Previously, Ms. Contreras worked at the American Academy of Family Physicians and the National Cancer Institute. She holds degrees from California State University, Los Angeles, and American University. If the witnesses, including those testifying remotely, now could stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before the subcommittee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I will now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes of testimony each. Mr. Lynn, why don't you get started?
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you on this extremely important topic. I am Barry Lynn, and I direct the Open Markets Institute, and it's good to see you all again. The shortage of baby formula is a deeply upsetting event for the families affected and the American people as a whole. Ensuring that every family with young children has access to high-quality formula at low prices is a challenge we should have mastered long ago. There's plenty of blame to share, both for the private corporations that dominate this business and the agencies that oversee it. But the problem goes far beyond private avarice or any failure to adequately fund or oversee the FDA. This breakdown is simply the latest in a long list of failures of the production systems on which Americans depend. Just over the last 2 years, this includes extreme shortages of face masks and other PPE in the early months of the COVID, causing thousands of avoidable deaths. The shutdown by COVID of super large slaughterhouses, resulting in empty meat cases across America. Deep shortages of semiconductors due to monopolization by TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, which shut assembly lines for cars, medical devices, electronics. The freezing up of container shipping systems, which disrupted thousands of manufacturing and construction businesses. The breakdown of gasoline distribution across the southeastern United States after a single cyber attack. Worse, we can trace the pattern of disruption back 20 years. This includes the near breakdown of food supplies in New York following Hurricane Sandy, deep, persistent, and widespread structural shortages of drugs, the near breakdown of the Big Six automobile production system in 2009 and subsequent bailout of General Motors and Chrysler, the collapse of the U.S. System for production of cat food in 2007. In every instance, the cause of the shutdown was concentration and choke pointing of capacity. Then there are the many disruptions and threats intimately interrelated with this choke pointing. This includes the potential for catastrophic cascading collapse of the industrial and financial systems as a whole due to the loss of access to a single industrial center or even a single plant. Direct dependence on China and other antagonistic regimes for essential goods and services in ways that expose our nation and individual businesses and citizens to coercion and extortion. Lack of capacity to produce weapons and other items essential to national defense in a timely manner. Inflation driven by the choke pointing of oil refining, semiconductors, and meat processing, and by monopolists taking opportunistic advantage of the crisis to jack up prices, as with airlines and credit cards. The suppression of production technologies that would lower costs and boost efficiency. None of these threats are new. I myself first detailed the fragility of international production systems and America's industrial exposure to the power of China in an article in Harper's 20 years ago in 2002, titled, 20 years ago this month, titled Unmade in America, The True Cost of a Global Assembly Line. I was not alone. The epidemiologist Michael Osterholm in 2005 described how a pandemic would disrupt highly concentrated supply chains, including for the face masks we need to protect ourselves from the disease itself. In 2010, a World Bank study of the financial crash of 2008 concluded that concentration of production networks has an inherent magnification effect on shocks. In short, Ronald Reagan's embrace of Robert Bork's radical efficiency theory for antitrust, in combination with Bill Clinton's embrace of Larry Summers' radical efficiency theory for trade, resulted in the bulldozing of almost every industrial system on which we depend and has pushed us to the brink of catastrophe. So what can we do today? First, restore our ability to identify and manage physical risk by recognizing the essential role that competition policy plays in engineering production and financial systems. Second, restore a structural bright line approach to anti-monopoly enforcement in keeping with the basic principles of checks and balances. Third, radically reduce the role in competition policy of economics and any intellectual tools unable to identify and understand the effects of power on structure. Fourth, identify all choke points in every supply chain on which the American people depend. Fifth, rebuild sufficient industrial capacity to ensure the resiliency and stability of industrial systems. And sixth, rebuild the capacity of federal and state agencies to use competition policy to identify and break choke points before they become dangerous. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Next up, I think it is Ms. Carney.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, Senator Blackburn hopefully is there. I can't see her, but I hope she's there from our great state of Tennessee. And committee members and my fellow distinguished panelists, I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak before you today and appreciate your willingness to allow me to appear virtually. My name is Ginger Carney. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist and international board certified lactation consultant and director of clinical nutrition and lactation services for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm here today on behalf of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which represents more than 112,000 nutrition professionals. As the past president of the Tennessee Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, I'm prepared to give you a sense of how this crisis is impacting families across the country. Since February 2022, dietitians have been constantly working to determine appropriate and safe formula alternatives for patients impacted by the current shortage. I have experienced the devastation of the formula supply chain disruption that has been placed on so many families in my hometown. In my role in a pediatric research hospital, we have experienced shortages in our enteral feeding formulas or formulas provided through a tube for those children who cannot or will not eat enough to sustain them. Many of our patients are children with cancer who cannot tolerate certain foods because their digestive systems have been compromised from chemotherapy and radiation, causing them to rely on specialized formula for their nutritional needs. One colleague in Miami, Florida, reported that parents will file prescriptions to pharmacies to obtain special formula, but it may take up to a month before a shipment is received, and then there has been no guarantee when the formula will be back in stock. Recently in Memphis, 2 children were admitted to our local pediatric hospital with dehydration caused by intolerance to a formula which had been substituted by their parents for their regular specialized formula. Caregivers caregivers are at their wits' end and feel that they must find something to feed their children. When an infant is hungry or a child is dependent on a specialized feeding, it can be life-threatening when a formula is not available. Another dietitian in Florida met with first-time parents of a set of premature twins in her clinic. She discovered that when their hypoallergenic formula had become unavailable, the parents resorted to giving the babies almond milk, thinking this was an appropriate substitution. The switch caused a reduction in the baby's calorie intake by nearly 60%. The babies were lethargic and malnourished, and it resulted in an emergency hospital admission. Imagine having to worry that you might not be able to keep your baby fed as your last can of formula is almost empty. Parents may drive for hours to nearby towns to find formula, and many families are not able to do this given financial or geographic limitations, which disproportionately impacts low-income and rural families. My WIC colleagues in Louisiana and Tennessee have similar experiences fielding panicked phone calls from caregivers. Some dietitians even ride around their cities taking pictures of store shelves to advise their clients which store has the formula they need. One mother remarked she was petrified that any formula could be contaminated. We appreciate that the Senate subcommittee is taking a close look at this crisis, but more needs to be done. First, we know the importance of the first 1,000 days of life for long-term health outcomes. We must track the cohort of infants experiencing this crisis and determine the short and long-term impact on their medical outcomes and nutrition security. To date, we are not aware of any efforts to formally document this. Secondly, we have not heard that this has happened anywhere other than the United States. Other developed countries seem to have managed shortages without significant issues. We must learn from others and revisit the laws and regulations, including a thorough examination from production and oversight to access and affordability. We should revisit and consider the guidelines in the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, commonly referred to as the WHO Code, to ensure that our most vulnerable population always has a safe, nutritious food supply available. Third, insurance companies must reduce the burden required for treatment authorization for non-formulary infant formulas. And lastly, we must do more to support women who want to breastfeed, especially as they return to work. There are too many systemic challenges for these working moms and families. We must examine the country's efforts to promote breastfeeding and find ways to provide the support they need. The U.S. is the only high-income country with no statutory national paid maternity leave, and the U.S. parents are continually bombarded with commercial promotion of breast milk substitutes that is forbidden by law in many countries. An increase in the breastfeeding rate in the country would also decrease the demand for formula. These efforts would significantly improve access to safe and stable nutrition for infants in our country. Thank you again, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Lincecum.
You got the name perfect on the second try. Is great. Chair Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, distinguished senators, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. My name is Scott Lincecum, and today I'll discuss the current problems in the infant formula market and how we got here, with an emphasis on concentration and antitrust policy. As has been widely reported, the market is concentrated and stagnant, and this has continued and contributed to the current crisis when the largest U.S. formula producer, Abbott Labs, initiated a recall and shut down a major factory in Michigan. There were no easy or immediate replacements to fill a gaping hole in the domestic market, and we've been scrambling ever since. This troubling situation, however, does not justify new U.S. antitrust actions or expanded government power to police anti-competitive practices. The main justification for antitrust action is traditionally the existence of a market failure, natural imperfections in a relatively free private marketplace that give a monopoly or oligopoly market power to keep prices elevated or competitors out. In the case of infant formula, however, today's problems are primarily due to federal government policy, not any sort of market failure. First, We block almost all foreign-made infant formula from the U.S. market. Most imports are subject to a complex and opaque system of tariff rate quotas, under which high tariffs increase even further when certain quantity thresholds are met. Imports from supposedly free trade agreement partners are mostly restricted too. Overall, the average effective duty rate on infant formula imported in the United States is 25.1%. Adding insult to injury, we impose significant non-tariff barriers on formula imports. Producers wishing to sell here must meet strict FDA labeling, nutrition, registration, and inspection requirements. Despite strong domestic demand for formulas from Europe and elsewhere, formulas approved by unquestionably competent regulators abroad, shipments have been routinely seized and destroyed by customs because they didn't comply with FDA rules. Due to these barriers, around 98% of the U.S. infant formula market is annually serviced by domestic production, a domestic market share among the highest of any major food product, and one that likely fuels concentration here. Research shows, for example, that imports serve as a major check on the market power of large U.S. manufacturers across a wide range of industries. Concentration falls in industries experiencing import growth, and it rises in industries with little foreign competition. Such findings are obviously relevant for a concentrated U.S. infant formula market with essentially no imports. Second, federal government policy amplifies domestic market concentration in two key ways. Most importantly, the expansion and design of the WIC program effectively ensures that the U.S. market remains concentrated. Since the program's inception in 1974, WIC participation has grown dramatically. Today, it accounts for more than half of all domestic formula sales. This buying power allows the government to demand that producers offer steep discounts. In exchange, the state WIC agencies offer big sole source contracts to winning bidders. Now, this is undoubtedly a good system for U.S. taxpayers, but it creates serious competition problems. First, only large established producers have the capacity, capital, and regulatory expertise to navigate the WIC contracting process and to offer steep upfront discounts on large volume government contracts. Indeed, the three largest producers in the United States hold all WIC contracts. Second, research shows that WIC's large exclusive contracts help winning bidders gain market share and raise prices in the non-WIC market, and thus become the dominant supplier in the state at issue. This is a recipe for concentration, disrupted only by the current crisis. But as one industry expert recently told the Wall Street Journal, if the government doesn't change the WIC system, things will go back to the way they were, a forced duopoly, emphasis on forced. Finally, stringent FDA regulations specific to infant formula are also likely amplifying domestic market concentration. Since 1980, the United States has regulated formula more strictly than other foods here and more strictly than formula in other countries. Regardless of whether we think this level of regulation is justified, it likely contributes to concentration in the infant formula market. Recent research finds, for example, that increases in regulation are associated with decreases in the number of firms in a market and lower startup rates. This is supported by anecdotal evidence with respect to infant formula. Until a few weeks ago, there hadn't been a new formula manufacturer in the United States since 2007, and it took the new player, By Heart, more than $190 million and 5 years to start production here. The company's CEO recently attributed a lack of market entrance to the time and expense needed, quote, to study and understand FDA regulations. The head of another startup, Bobby, said much the same, just in the same article. In closing, the infant formula market is indeed concentrated, and this search situation has surely contributed to the current crisis. However, these problems are not the natural result of a relatively free market in desperate need of new antitrust regulation. They are not a lesson to be learned for new and expansive competition policy. Instead, these problems have been caused primarily by government policies that restrict competition from abroad, that bolster the dominance of a few large domestic corporations, and that stifle new market entrants. Policymakers here looking to improve the U.S. infant formula market should therefore reform these policies, not add yet another layer of government regulation atop the numerous ones we already have. I propose several such reforms in my written statement and would welcome discussing them with you further in the Q&A. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Last but not least, Ms. Contreras.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jeanette Contreras. I am the Director of Health Policy at the National Consumers League. I appreciate the opportunity to testify remotely today, especially due to COVID. Founded in 1899, NCL is the America's oldest consumer advocacy organization. A core principle of our advocacy is that the marketplace should encourage competition to guarantee that consumers have choices for safe goods and services at a fair price. Monopolies harm competition, leaving consumers with fewer options at higher prices. Monopolistic practices are especially harmful when they occur in the healthcare arena, where they can exacerbate health disparities. We share the concern of new parents regarding the recent shortage of infant formula. Our hearts go out to those parents who've lost babies, whose infants have suffered devastating health consequences from the contaminated formula. At NCL, we believe all goods and services sold to consumers should be safe and meet all legal requirements, including regulatory guidelines set forth by the FDA. NCL applauds the FDA and the administration for adopting a multifaceted approach to increase the supply of infant formula, including temporarily allowing foreign manufacturers to sell their products in the US. Additionally, we believe invoking the Defense Production Act to prioritize getting needed inputs to infant formula manufacturers was sound policy. These measures are helping to solve the immediate logistical problem of getting formula onto store shelves across the country. While addressing the immediate formula shortage is most urgent, we're also troubled that it took the FDA almost 4 months to act on a whistleblower complaint sent to the agency. This complaint should have received immediate attention given the gravity of the allegations against the Abbott facility. We support a full investigation and, if warranted, bringing in criminal and civil charges against those who falsified data. NCL also recommends that the U.S. create a single food safety agency and dedicate an office to overseeing the safety and supply of infant formula. It should concern every American that one manufacturer controls 40% of the U.S. infant formula market. Only 3 companies, Abbott, Mead Johnson, and Nestle, control 98% of the industry. Consolidation in the infant formula industry is a major contributor to the current crisis, but it is only one of many cases where market concentration in recent decades has limited competition and harmed consumers. For example, NCL continues to raise concerns about the consolidation of the airline industry. Due to weak enforcement of existing antitrust laws from 2005 to 2015, the number of major U.S. airlines declined from 9 to 4. And today they control more than 80% of the domestic U.S. market. Our antitrust laws have also failed to protect consumers who attend live events. After merging with Ticketmaster in 2010, Live Nation Entertainment controls roughly 80% of the primary ticketing market in the US. As anyone who's purchased tickets recently can attest, this has led to an increase in added fees and the basic price of tickets. Stronger antitrust enforcement would especially be beneficial for curtailing anti-competitive conduct in the healthcare industry, where we've seen consolidation lead to higher costs for consumers without an increase in quality or access to care. We are pleased that the Biden administration is looking into how hospital prices increase after acquisitions. We're also hopeful that the ongoing review of DOJ and FTC merger enforcement guidelines will result in more action by those agencies. NCL also applauds the recent FTC decision to open an investigation into unfair business practices of pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. NCL works tirelessly to raise awareness of the outsized role that PBMs play in driving up prescription drug prices for consumers. According to a recent report, the 3 biggest PBMs controlled roughly 77% of all U.S. prescription drug claims in 2020. And a recent Senate Finance Committee report found some PBMs are getting a 70% rebate on insulin, while out-of-pocket costs for this life-saving medication continue to rise. These cases are just a few examples of how monopolies and anti-competitive practices have become a problem for consumers. To ensure crises like today's formula shortage do not happen again, market consolidation must be addressed so that the temporary shutdown of a single factory does not result in the collapse of an entire supply chain. Whether it is baby formula, airline tickets, live event tickets, or pharmaceutical sales, the lack of competition is having increasingly negative impacts on consumer welfare and requires urgent action. Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Lee, thank you for holding today's hearing and inviting NCL to speak about this important issue. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, all of you. I guess I'll start with you, Ms. Contreras. We know, as you mentioned, there are many factors that, and our other witnesses have mentioned, that have contributed to the current crisis on baby formula. But we've heard today, and everyone has acknowledged, the fact that the industry is heavily concentrated is clearly one of them. As the witnesses testified, currently, 4 companies control nearly 90% of the domestic market, and Abbott alone controls roughly 50% of the market. Could you talk about how this concentration directly impacts consumers? We know what happened with baby formula, but why, when you have that kind of numbers, do you see shortages or higher prices in this market and in others?
Yeah, I'm not the expert on the market, but we do see that consumers, are, suffering due to inflation for rising prices on all food, and this particularly our low-income families that depend on programs like WIC to provide supplies of infant formula in their local markets. And when the supplies are not there, we see the social determinants of health come into play where people can't, travel or access to, or have access to transportation to go to 50 markets within their area to find, infant formula on their shelves, so this is definitely a challenge for consumers. We know that the consolidation of markets is a problem. It limits choice, and it also increases prices for consumers. We've seen that time and again.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lin, the baby formula shortage is a stark illustration of how fragile a concentrated industry can be and how concentration can have devastating consequences for families, for communities. Here, a recall and shutdown at a single plant had ripple effects for families across the country. Can you talk about other industries that you have already or are primed to experience shortages if there's a sudden market disruption or an issue in the supply chain?
Yes, that's an excellent question. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of industries that if there's a single glitch in the supply chain, the loss of a single factory, the loss of a single industrial center would result in effects that would be far more devastating than what we've seen here. This is actually 40% concentration is actually pretty good compared to a lot of industries. And an example would be, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which go into our generic drugs. North of 95% of those active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. If there's any glitch in trade between the United States and China, we don't have drugs on our shelves. The electronics that we use every day, which are life-saving, essential to survival in many respects, and increasingly so, if there's any glitch in trade between the United States and China, these systems cease to function because we have allowed close to 100% concentration of many key capacities inside of China. It's not only China. We see concentration of capacities up to 100% in Taiwan, in Japan, in Korea, in certain places in the United States. 100% capacity in a single place. Actually, and even in what we see also in many industries is, when it looks like there's a lot of competition, there's often that competition hides the fact that you have duopoly, structural duopoly that has been structured by the corporations for their own benefits, in which you often have corporations trading off 90-10 splits. This is where one corporation has 90 in a particular market, and the next corporation has 90 in the next market.
There we go. That's a new one for me. Could you talk about updating our antitrust laws and why that would be helpful? I note that Mr. Lincecum talked about how that would add regulations, and I was kind of sitting there, in all due respect, thinking about all these court cases that have come out that have kind of clawed away at what used to be a robust antitrust enforcement by actually adding all of these things that people are doing, and economists and everything else, and just completely weighting down this process. And I was thinking about some of the simplicity of just simply shifting a burden on what you have to prove in order to just give a little bit of a leg up. So it's easier to bring these cases. As Bill Baer, the former head of antitrust during President Obama, noted, some of these proposals and mergers shouldn't even be coming out of the boardroom. And we now see the effect when there's been enforcement weakened by court decisions, not enough resources, which we already know, and then an inability of a Congress to stand up to any large interest. And we are bringing back, one of the things I'm going to do in this tech debate is bring back that cartoon of all the huge antitrust balloons hanging over the Senate, looking down at us. They just have different names now. They're no longer Standard Oil and the Railroad Trust and the Sugar Trust. They now have the names Apple, Google, and Facebook and Amazon. And when we have that perfect storm of the enforcers not having enough resources, the Congress refusing to stand up to anyone and act because, well, hey, maybe we can go on another day and deal with something else and talk about something on TV and not deal with these long-term headwinds that of monopolies that are limiting ability to compete and hurting us in every market under the sun. And then you also have the issue of the court decisions that made it harder to bring these cases. What do you think we should do when it comes to our antitrust laws?
No, it's a great question. There's two quick answers. One, philosophy. You know, as I mentioned before, what got us into this problem is, to a large extent, the efficiency philosophy that was imposed on antitrust by the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, and the efficiency of philosophy that was imposed on the trade system by the Clinton administration in the 1990s. So we've been seeking efficiency through our antitrust system of regulation for 40 years now, and the result is extreme consolidation in every sector of our economy. So number one, fix the philosophy. Number two, enforcement. As you just said, we need much more enforcement. We need much more aggressive enforcement. That means, over the last 40 years, the courts have taken the philosophy, this incredibly unwise philosophy of efficiency, and they have built it into the law. So we can overcome that slowly, or we can overcome that swiftly. And better law right now will allow us to overcome this fantastically dangerous philosophy of efficiency much more swiftly. So, you know, and so the proposals that have been put forth by you and other members of the Senate and the Congress are of essential importance in dealing with the core root of these problems.
Thank you very much. Turn over to Senator Lee.
Mr. Lincecum, in response to Mr. Lynn's comments a moment ago, in your view, was it antitrust philosophy or federal policy that got us into this current mess with infant formula?
Well, as I said in my statement, Senator, clearly, in this case, it's government policy. If you look at our trade policies, our regulatory policies, our food assistant policies, regardless of whether you think we need these regulations, we need these policies, the fact is that they are perfectly consistent with the economics literature of what happens when you have a domestic market, for example, that is 98% serviced by domestic manufacturers. You get a concentrated market. When you have very high levels of regulation, you get a concentrated market. When you have an effective blockade on safe, healthy formula from Europe, for example, that's in high demand, you end up with a more concentrated market. And you end up with a market that simply can't respond in times of shock. Prices can't adjust and supplies can't adjust. So there's nothing to do with philosophy or a lack of antitrust regulation. It has everything to do with those specific policies.
So in other words, no matter what philosophy was prevailing in antitrust law, if you have a single plant closure, that single plant closure is not going to result in a nationwide shortage if any of the other factors that you mentioned weren't there.
Correct.
You take away any leg from that stool falls, and we've got competition, we've got at least not a nationwide shortage. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think throughout the pandemic, we've actually seen time and time again that contrary to a lot of the political rhetoric, the industries that are most fragile, the industries suffering the biggest shortages, whether it's baby formula or fertilizer or chassis or other dairy products or pickup trucks or building material, their findings, I hope they find something.
Yeah. Yeah, and no, I think they deserve credit for that as well. I think that's good. So, all right. So, in light of how we got here, how do we get out of it? What can we do about this in the future? And tell me what you think of the Formula Act and whether it would help.
Yes, Senator. I think the Formula Act is really right along the lines of what we should be thinking in terms of infant formula. We need to eliminate tariffs and tariff rate quotas on imported infant formula. We need to revise trade agreements like the USMCA to ensure that we have the free flow of formula from trading partners. We need to join other trade agreements with trusted nations. There's this Trans-Pacific Partnership out there that we used to almost be a part of. That would, again, encourage the free flow of these products and regulatory harmonization, allowing our regulators to talk to each other. We should, speaking of regulations, require the FDA to permit the importation, marketing, and domestic sale of any infant formula approved by a competent regulator abroad. Now, I'm not talking about China here. I'm talking about Australia, Canada, the EU, the Scandinavian countries, Japan, New Zealand, Switzerland, all major dairy producers, all major formula producers, and all with very competent regulatory regimes.
And I assume comparable outcomes as well. I mean, I assume they're
Yes, there's not
seeing
widespread baby problem, babies dying in these countries or anything like that. These are very competent regulatory regimes. In fact, Europe is the largest exporter in the world of formula. Companies in other countries invest in Europe to export because they have such high quality and high standards. And as I mentioned in my statement, a lot of moms here want European baby formula. There's high demand for that product, and they can't get it, or at least they couldn't get it until the president started airlifting it in during the crisis.
Okay, so help us understand why they want it, and also what makes it more difficult to get.
Sure. First, and we'll put this on the record. I had a column in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago on the European baby formula issue. I'll just summarize it quickly. A lot of moms have said that they prefer the quality or the content or simply the recipe of European baby formula. They found that their babies respond better to that, no fussy tummies and the rest, as I think parents in this room can certainly understand. They have sought to import that product, but because of FDA restrictions, because of those tariffs, no European producers are willing to expend the time and capital needed to establish distribution channels, get into supermarkets. So instead, there's this gray market out there for European baby formula that goes through third-party retailers. Now, that market was pretty healthy, no pun intended, until a couple years ago when the FDA started cracking down on European product. Customs started seizing and destroying formula at the border. The FDA issued a major recall because certain product, the labels weren't exactly like the FDA wanted, or the scoopers were a slightly different size. Never mind that those third-party retailers were actually translating instructions, giving the conversions and the rest.
If only they were so aggressive on fentanyl coming across our southern border.
Well, and the FDA certainly could play a helpful role here. The FDA or the USDA could provide instruction conversions, could provide these things, could provide nutritional information, instead of blocking and literally destroying formula at the border only a few weeks ago. It really just makes no sense.
So the destruction of formula coming across the border, and this is something you described as a gray market. Well, what do you mean by gray market as opposed to black market?
Sure. So the FDA does allow personal shipments of European product. But those, of course, are very small shipments, and that can be really expensive for parents. So ultimately, there has been a middleman. Middlemen have entered the market and imported these products for resale in the United States. Now, this is technically not legal, but it was occurring without much problem for years. It was only until the last couple of years that this has been shut down.
Because we just couldn't have American moms and dads feeding gasp foreign-made European baby formula to their babies.
Right.
This was such a crisis that it had to be destroyed.
Yes, and if you actually, I've spent a little time on the mommy blogs lately, and you find parents that are extremely distressed about their inability to get a product that for years was actually helping their children, get over, sleep through the night, and be healthy. And that's unfortunately still continuing up until just recently. A colleague of mine sent me some screenshots of those right before this that you're showing that there's this still going on. Parents still have formula that's been detained. They have no idea when they're going to get it.
Can I ask one follow-up on this?
Yes, of course.
It'll be brief. All right. Have we seen this happen in other markets, or are there any other markets in the United States that you think are in a comparable position where, because of this combination of regulations, import restrictions, protectionist policies, one manufacturer shut down or slow down could shut everything down?
You know, I have to say, I've been looking at supply chains for the last 2+ years because of the pandemic, and I haven't seen an industry this fragile. It is about a textbook case of what happens when you put walls around the country and block all the imports, and then have a government contractor as a monopsonist in the market, effectively consolidating the domestic market even further. Like you said, it's a perfect storm for problems.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Next up, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you both. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having this hearing. We're here because of a concentrated market, potential monopolistic dominance that may have exacerbated or contributed to the shortage in infant formula that has so terrified and harmed American families. And the sole source WIC contracting procedure may have likewise contributed to or aggravated the consolidation in the market. The government is not blameless here. But what outrages me most here is, in fact, the Food and Drug Administration's delay in catching this problem. And I realize it's not antitrust, but it's kind of the elephant in the room. There were at least 9 infant deaths and countless illnesses, we don't even know how many, linked to the formulas produced at Abbott's Sturgis, Michigan plant, which is an increase over the previously reported number. We're just getting the truth. And it's coming to us literally a year after, more than a year after, the first whistleblower report in February 2021. The FDA didn't do any disclosure until a year after the whistleblower report. And we're just now learning the dimensions of this disaster. The FDA failed to act. It betrayed its trust. I am writing to the FDA Inspector General asking for an investigation, because this kind of dereliction and failure to disclose, it's a combined betrayal of trust, is absolutely unacceptable. And again, the consolidation within the industry, maybe giving that kind of power to Abbott, maybe its capture of the agency. We have yet to know the full story, but my hope is the Inspector General will give us some insight, because the FDA had a trust here, a stewardship, which it failed to uphold. I'm very pleased that the FTC has announced that it's launching an investigation into the causes of this crisis. I hope it will be penetrating and insightful and hard-hitting and frank and timely. We need to know right away, because, in fact, infants have been denied a lot of food that they need, and parents have been seeing their lives turned upside down in ways that we all understand as a parent. I will never forget my first assignment as a new father, eventually of 4, and my nervous run to the store to pick up the first formula that my first son promptly spit up in my face. But this is sort of basic responsibility. And I'm very troubled by economic discrimination, which I hope the FDA will investigate. Economic discrimination can have a disproportionate impact on inner city communities that lack access to suburban big box scores. Economic discrimination, in effect, is formula manufacturers and distributors offering more favorable terms to the big box retailers over smaller regional retailers. And at least one small retailer in Connecticut has expressed concern that they were denied inventory and stock for their bare shelves as larger chains with larger contracts receive special treatment. So this effect of consolidation, the dominance of four giants, may also affect distribution and retailing, and I hope the FTC will explore it. No infant should go hungry just because they live in a certain zip code. I think we can all agree on that idea. And I'm eager to see the results of an investigation. But let me ask both of you, first Mr. Lin, can you explain how discriminatory terms can exacerbate the shortage of this kind of essential product like baby formula? And what are our best tools to ensure that small grocers or urban grocers or any other retailers and pharmacies can source vital products like baby formula?
Thank you, Senator. That's an excellent question. Discrimination, the foundations of anti-monopoly in the United States and actually in the UK and Britain stand on non-discrimination. We could trace this back to 400 years ago to the statute of monopolies, 1624. And non-discrimination means that everyone gets treated the same. Equal justice before the law and equal rights before the monopolist. It's the same thing, really. And how did we achieve this in the United States in a distributed, complex economy such as we developed in the 20th century? We did it through rules on pricing and limiting the ability of people to discriminate in pricing and terms. So for most of the 20th century and actually much of the 19th century, large corporations, essential facilities, retailers were prohibited from discriminating, and also sellers were prohibited from discrimination in sort of the sale of their products. Everyone got the same terms at the same price. We had rules such as the Robinson-Patman law that achieved this, that applied this to the retail system. All of these approaches were torn apart, were thrown away in the 1980s. So we now have a situation in which discrimination allows the big to get bigger and the poor to get nothing.
Thank you for that excellent answer. I'm going to ask Mr. Contreras, because I think he deserves a little airtime here, to respond to that same question without meaning any disrespect, but I'm about to end my time. Thank you. No problem.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. Welcome to each of the witnesses. In July of 2021, the out-of-stock rate for baby formula was only 8%. Fast forward to March of 2022, that rate had risen to 30%. Question to the witnesses. Wouldn't you say that when a rate nearly quadruples, that it warrants a response from the federal government and ideally a president that is aware of the crisis that is happening under his administration? Mr. Lincecum?
I would expect a response, Senator. I think that I will give the president a bit of credit in that I do appreciate that he is trying to get formula in the country from abroad. It is a tacit recognition that imports can play and should play an important role in this market, and what happens when you have a market that's effectively walled off from import competition. Unfortunately, however, that is a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. That the market has been so distorted by all of the government policies that I mentioned in my opening statement that there's just so much that a couple airlifts and photo ops can really do at this point. It is something that has been years in the making.
Mr. Lynn, your thoughts?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I agree that the President of the United States has begun to address this issue. I think that he has taken important steps to deal with the closure of the plant and also to deal with the shortages themselves. Now, I think that...
But of course, the rise from 8% to 30% in March of this year, President Biden has said he was unaware of it, that he first became aware of this in April of this year, after we were facing major shortages across the country. Ms. Carney, let me ask you, what negative effects have you seen on the children in your hospital from this formula shortage?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. We are
Can't hear
continually
you.
struggling.
There. Okay, it's all good now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Senator Cruz. We have been struggling over the last few months to make sure that we find appropriate substitutions for the formulas that we cannot find, and things that will be metabolized and absorbed properly in our patients. But more than that, out in my community, I have seen a lot of dietitians struggling to help mothers and babies find the right substitutions that they can feed. For instance, I referred to the almond milk situation in one community, and I really feel like we need to really focus more on this help to mothers and babies. We're talking about lives of babies and children. I don't know that we can just say, okay, the market is open, let every mother choose which formula she wants. They really need some guidance, some medical guidance, and some guidance from professionals that know nutrition. So I love that we're trying to think about ways we can make more formula available, but it's not going to be something that mothers and parents can just go out there and choose on their own. They do need some guidance in doing that.
So, Ms. Carney, moms around the country are being told to just breastfeed. But am I right that for a significant percentage of mothers, they have difficulty doing so, and indeed there may be medical reasons why doing so is not advisable?
Really appreciate that question. We know that breast milk, human breast milk, is the optimal choice for infant nutrition. And if we can promote that more and have mothers educated on how to breastfeed and get the support they need by reaching out to pediatric dietitians and dietitians that specialize in maternal nutrition and international board certified lactation consultants, these mothers can breastfeed. There's probably a very small percentage of mothers who cannot breastfeed. Many mothers think that they're not able to breastfeed because they run into problems, challenges, even things that I mentioned with going back to work. That's a huge roadblock sometimes. But if we can address those and help mothers initiate and sustain breastfeeding, I think we will see a lot better health for our babies and children, and also more satisfied moms, and being able to achieve the goals that they set for themselves with breastfeeding.
Thank you. Mr. Lincecum, on February 24th of this year, Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, I believe that war was entirely avoidable and could have been avoided had President Biden not waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And indeed, in January of this year, I forced a vote on the Senate floor to impose those sanctions. At the time, President Zelensky begged the United States Senate to stand with Ukraine, impose those sanctions, and said it was the only thing that would stop Putin from invading Ukraine. Unfortunately, 44 Senate Democrats voted with President Biden against sanctioning Russia, against sanctioning Putin, and that was, I believe, the immediate precipitating cause of the war in Ukraine. Now, you're not here testifying about that war, but the FDA said that the invasion caused, quote, additional uncertainty in the infant formula supply chain, as Ukraine is a major exporter of sunflower oil, an ingredient used in many infant formulas. In your judgment, should the administration have been aware of and on alert to the supply chain challenges and the threat of a formula shortage caused by the fact that one of the ingredients in formula was at a risk of shortage itself?
Thank you, Senator. I can certainly speak to the first point. There have been signs starting last year and even in January, that there were problems in the infant formula market. So I certainly think that the administration should have been aware of potential supply chain issues arising in the infant formula market and potentially exacerbated by the conflict. On the sunflower issue, though, I'm going to have to defer. I just don't know the extent to which that was a major issue prior to Russia's invasion. I would note, however, that again, in normal markets, supply and demand can adjust relatively quickly. Unfortunately, in the U.S. infant formula market, we do not have normally functioning supply and demand due to these government distortions. And I haven't even gotten into the upstream input distortions that U.S. dairy policy, milk pricing programs, and other protectionism cause and compound the problems in the market. So certainly I think that the administration should have been aware of the overall issue, but the sunflower issue, I am not sure.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Next up, the patient, Senator Booker. Thank you for your leadership in this area.
In the medical context, I'm not sure if I want to be the patient, but thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm grateful for this hearing. I'm grateful for the ranker and the chairwoman for hosting it. I just want to talk really quick about the role of redundancy in resilient supply chains, and it's really frustrating me. And some of this conversation has already been had, but you know, the current crisis we're finding ourselves is not just the result of Abbott Formula's recall in February, but rather the outcome of decades-long effort by the formula industry to keep its market highly concentrated. Today, as has been said already, 4 companies control 90% of the infant formula market. Instead of making a lot of the necessary investments in product safety and resilient supply chains, formula producers have instead focused on further using their resources to consolidate operations and padding profits for their stakeholders. To me, this is horrific, and it is caused a horrific reality when it comes to children going hungry or becoming sick, or that ultimately created such a fragile chain that one supply, the closure of a single plant in Michigan, can cause such a ripple effect. And so I'm pleased at the actions we've made so far, passing a bipartisan bill to ensure babies who receive formula through special supplemental nutrition program for women and children have the formula they needed. President Biden's actions and the like, but maybe I'll start with Mr. Lin. I'm really frustrated, and you've alluded to this, that when 4 companies have gained such a control over the formula market through acquisitions, it leads to a lack of innovation. It leads to a lack of resiliency in a consolidated market. You would agree with that statement?
Absolutely.
And so, as I see with other companies, and I see this with big food companies in general, when they consolidate these innovative brands that often market themselves as being healthier, more organic-like, and they get a real following of people when they're consolidated or grabbed by these bigger companies who don't have the same values, it undermines the health and well-being, perhaps even of the food or formula they're providing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Scott, you were shaking your head violently, so I want to.
No, I was, well, I've written a lot about resiliency over the last couple of years, as you can imagine. I think a few points that are worth noting when it comes to in creating what I would call real supply chain resiliency and a really robust market. First is, if you look at the economic research that's out there, what we find is that reshoring our supply chains, or having effectively autarky like we have in the infant formula market, is actually really bad for resiliency. That supply diversity, economic openness, low trade barriers really does help in terms of having a better, more stable market. And that's critical.
And this is why you had this perverse reality in other industries during a pandemic where food prices were going up for people in general. Food producers were having record profits and still exporting their goods to other countries, correct?
Well, I'm not sure how that relates to the issue of openness and resiliency, but in general, it is far better to not have all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
It's far better to.
Let me push you on how it does.
Sure.
I mean, I watched how the pig producers, for example, were slaughtering pigs and burying them over.
Right.
Yet exports were still going up, and local people couldn't get access to the food, even though the demand was there. That shows a system that lacks resiliency, right?
Well, you have to think, though, what happens if we say we're to restrict those exports? Then you actually discourage investment in the domestic industry.
Right.
You discourage investment in the domestic industry, you might solve today's crisis, but you're actually going to have a bigger crisis tomorrow. In fact, the United States, used to ban the exportation of oil, and that actually depressed our oil and gas sector. So to the extent, you have to live sometimes with the imperfections in the market, but time and time again, what we find is that efforts to close off the market, efforts to restrict imports and exports, efforts to over-regulate a market end up creating far bigger problems in terms of supply chain resiliency in the long term.
And then give me some input, either one, on how requirements, how the FTC or perhaps even WIC and the USDA should consider taking action to create less fragile systems that the industry is creating. Barry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the near term, imports actually are a way to deal with this, but I'll say something. This is a really important thing. Simply opening the border to more imports on a permanent basis over the long term will make a broken system even less resilient, absent additional measures. If you just leave it to private corporations, if there are no competition rules set on the new market that you are creating, which is an international market, then you will see consolidation at an international, at a global level. We've seen this in sector after sector after sector. Simply opening the borders is a pathway to making a bad situation
I got that point. I got a minute
worse.
and 20 seconds. I want to try to get two more questions in. I sent a letter to the USDA to address the agency taking action to deal with the high levels of concentration. Since then, I've learned that Rickett Binkkaiser, if I'm pronouncing it right, who owns, manufactures, and Familia Infamil formula, announced it would seek a buyer for its formula production. I'm concerned about that. In the midst of this crisis, one of the three largest producers may face further disruptions. Am I right to be concerned about that sale?
Yes.
Well, I think we also need to ask why are they looking to offload that investment? And I think, as you mentioned, the WIC program's distortions of the market are a really big part of that. When you control more than half of the market, as the WIC program does, and you're forcing companies to bid against each other to provide discounts of around 90% off of wholesale, it's just not a place you want to invest. As I mentioned in my opening statement, it takes $200 million in 5 years to start a baby formula factory in the United States due to the levels of regulation. When you combine that with the import protection, it's just not an area where there's an easy buck to be made. We want it to be easy to invest. We want people to want to invest in that sector.
All right, out of respect for my colleague from Tennessee, I'm going to maybe just submit my last question or so for the record, but thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I see Senator Blackburn has joined us. Please go. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And yes, we've been busy with the NDAA, and we're taking a break, so I was so pleased to get over here. When you look at this nationwide shortage of baby formula, Tennesseans have really felt the brunt of this. We have repeatedly been unfortunately, in the top states that are most affected by this. Some formulas, the most popular brands, 54% is out of stock. And we've seen parents that have had to drive long distances to get formula. We have 2 children that were hospitalized because of this. Last month, I think that so many people in Tennessee that I've talked to were so offended by the president's statement saying, and I'm quoting him, if we'd been better mind readers, I guess we could have known about this. They just really took offense to that, because you go back and you look at what happened in February with the voluntary recall, 25% due to supply chain issues. And then you have to ask, and Tennesseans ask me regularly, why is it that the Biden administration was so slow to respond to this issue? And is it Lencioni?
Lincecum.
Lincecone, okay. Give me your best take on that. And then, Mr. Lynn, I'd like to come to you on it.
Well, I do agree with you that in retrospect, the infant formula market is a perfect case for what happens when you have trade walls around the country and high regulatory barriers to production. Look, and WIC is a perfect example. You know, we've had research on WIC and WIC's effect on concentrating the market for more than a decade plus, sponsored by the USDA, in fact. We've had these tariffs and dairy protectionism around for decades. In fact, it goes back to the New Deal, a lot of these distortions.
So you see it as an issue of consolidation for the market and for the government access program.
Yeah, policy-created consolidation on both the trade side and on the domestic side. And quite frankly, unfortunately, as I mentioned in my open, Customs has been seizing European baby formula at the border, destroying it for a long while now. So yes, I do think that we should have known a little more that this was a problem waiting to happen.
Mr. Lynn?
Thank you, Senator. This is a report from the U.S.-China Security Review Commission from 2002. In it, it talks about fragility of our supply chains because of high degrees of concentration. Fragility of our supply chains for semiconductors and electronics, and on and on and on. This is from 2002. Now, President Biden said, well, if we've been better mind readers, well, the fact is that we knew this problem was in the offing 20 years ago. Not just in baby formula, but in every sector of our industrial system. We have been ignoring this problem for 20 years. We have ample evidence that this is a fundamental structural problem that derives from the changes that we made in antitrust policy in the Reagan and Clinton eras. This is a bipartisan problem. Both parties came together.
And there are some of us who have talked about this for quite a while in these supply chains, whether it is computer chips, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which that is something that is a discussion for another day, but it's quite significant. And indeed, Senator Menendez and I had legislation that would address that. I do want to come to Ms. Carney, and I think she is coming to us virtually. Do we have her?
Yes, in fact, she mentioned you, Senator Blackburn.
Okay, there you are. Okay, thank you so much. We welcome you. St. Jude is such an important part of our community in Tennessee, and I'm so delighted that we could have your expertise. I would like to hear from you in your capacity. How could, and as you look at this marketplace and accessing formulas for children that are sick, developing these nutritional plans, what could the federal government be doing to better support competition and innovation? And then when you look at the WIC program and the allowances that need to be there, if you had your magic wand, what changes would you make?
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. It is an honor to speak with you from our great state of Tennessee. I'm looking at it from a registered dietitian viewpoint, and especially with working in the clinical setting in the hospital. I know that over the last few months, we have had many challenges, and in my previous job, I worked a lot more with the WIC program, and I know that WIC has always been there to meet the needs, the nutritional needs of women, infants, and children. And I want to make sure that I don't think we can. This is going to sound funny, but throw the baby out with the bathwater. WIC may have some problems, but I know that WIC has been invaluable to me as a pediatric dietitian in my years of practice. And I know that we need to have something like what the WIC program offers that provides the nutrition for mothers and infants and children. At St. Jude, we are struggling a little bit with the supply chain issues and trying to find not only those infant formulas, but formulas that provide total nutrition for many of the children that we deal with. They're specialized formulas. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on regulations. I am a nutrition expert, and I know that it is so important to have the tools that are needed by dietitians to make sure that the patients are fed appropriately and that all their nutrition requirements are met. We really need to make sure that if anything happens to WIC, that we make up the $1.7 billion in savings that the sole contract has saved us. There's much support that's given to other programs that feed not only women, infants, and children, but other people in the community. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope that sheds a little light on it anyway.
Well, it does, and I thank you for that, and I will want to visit with you a little bit more, looking at the process you go through to educate parents, to work with parents, how you develop a program of alternatives in order to work this, because as the other witnesses have said, we should have known this was out there as a potential problem, and it never should have come to this. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackburn. Senator Ossoff has joined us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panelists here in person and remotely for your testimony and expertise. Ms. Carney, I appreciate the work that you do, and we've got a 6-month-old daughter at home. My wife is a fourth-year medical resident working 60-plus hours a week. The challenges of child nutrition have become personal to me and clear to me in ways that previously I could only hear others describe. I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Carney, for you to discuss in your experience the particular challenges that working moms and lower-income moms have getting nutrition to infant babies, and how you work around that in your role in the healthcare space.
Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Yeah, I'd be glad to address that as I've been working with moms and babies pretty much my entire career, and as a registered dietitian, as I mentioned before, we know that human breast milk is the ideal feeding for infants. Many mothers may start out breastfeeding, and they may, breastfeed for a few weeks for as long as they have maternity leave. And I've noticed a huge drop off once mothers have to return to work. So many moms, even though we have some regulations in this country that state that every business over 50 employees has to have a mother's room or a private clean space for mothers to go express their milk, many companies and businesses still aren't doing that, or else mothers are embarrassed or they're afraid that they'll have retaliation and not be able to continue to do their job if they take breaks to express their milk. And by the way, mothers have to express their milk during the day if they want to maintain their milk supply. So that is an absolute must for mothers that want to continue breastfeeding, and they express at work, and usually that milk that they collect on one day is used for the baby's feedings the next day. So that's how it works, practically speaking. But so many mothers, like I said, are come up against challenges and roadblocks. And not only that, but mothers who are in lower paying jobs are sort of subject to even more discrimination in that aspect. I've found that, say, if you're working at Taco Bell, I mean, and you're at the window, when are you going to go take a break and say, oh, watch the window, I've got to go pump my milk? I mean, they're just not able to do that. It's just not accepted as the norm. So if I could have my wish, and somebody mentioned a magic wand, I would just wish that all mothers could get education prenatally and know how to start breastfeeding and continue breastfeeding if they do return to work. And this comes with education again and with support. It takes a lot of support to continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carney. I want to follow up with you as well, and just if you wouldn't mind expanding your reflection based on your experience of the challenges that working moms in particular have accessing some of the services and products that can be most helpful, whether it's lactation expertise, particularly in the first few months of a baby's life, when it might be a first-time mother and a newborn baby, as well as access to breast pumps and the affordability of breast pumps, which are necessary for those mothers to express while they're at work, and then the storage of the breast milk.
Great questions. Yeah, and I can look at this in two ways. First of all, if we're talking about lower income mothers or WIC participants, I have to salute the WIC program for the breastfeeding support that they've given, especially over the last, say, 15, 20 years. They've really stepped up and supported breastfeeding for those moms. I will say that I think that they could use some more experts in the WIC program. There are many dietitians who are employed in the WIC program, and many of them do have some extra education in clinical lactation, but there needs to be more so that more access to this professional care can be obtained by WIC moms and lower income moms. The WIC program has provided, I know, lots of different supplies to help the mothers be successful at breastfeeding. For instance, you mentioned breast pumps. Also, other things, bra pads, bras, other devices that mothers might need if they run into a problem. And the other one is mothers that have insurance. For instance, when I work at St. Jude, I provide prenatal breastfeeding classes for employees. I think, working in a world-renowned pediatric cancer institute, we should all be about the best nutrition for our own children. So I help employees prenatally with education, and postnatally, kind of the unofficial, maybe if you want to say unofficial lactation consultant in the hospital. And I have many moms, our physicians, our nurses, our researchers, our PhDs, even my own dietitians on my staff. They need help and support. And so I love to give that. And I think, other institutions hopefully are doing that too. And the one problem is that we need more dietitians as lactation consultants and to support that. And also mothers need access to that, even if they do have insurance. That's another story, but I hope that answers the question for you a little bit.
Thank you. We also need guaranteed parental leave in this country. Ms. Contreras, I'd like to ask you for your perspective in my brief remaining time. What are the recommendations you might have for Congress for policies that could expand access and lower the cost of, for example, breast pumps, other consumer products that are vital for mothers who are breastfeeding in the first months of a newborn's life and also working? And also, do you have any reflections, or do you want to go back and maybe bring something to us for the record on access to lactation expertise and consultancy, which can be so vital for particularly first-time moms? And that'll be my last question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if I have time to respond, then I'm happy to do so
Madam
now.
Chair, can she respond?
Or I can submit
No,
it.
no,
for the
it's
record.
fine.
Thank you so much. Go right ahead, please. The floor is
Okay,
yours.
great. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that one of the things of making products more accessible is, of course, including it in, coverage. I think that it was huge when consumers, or when health insurance companies started reimbursing and covering breast pumps. That didn't happen until, recently. And that was a huge issue that helped to make it more accessible. So if we could think about, how do we support moms as they go back to work? All of those things that they need could be covered by health insurance. It could be provided. A lot of times these services and support to moms are provided by nonprofit organizations, local community support organizations. And, it's great that there are a lot of community-based organizations out there, but they're just helping moms to navigate the already complicated, health insurance and plans and support that they need. So if it's one thing I could say is that we want to make sure that, that moms are better able to support it, to navigate, accessing all this and having health insurance plans help to cover it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, very good. Senator Lee, do you want to ask a few more questions, and then I could close out? I wanted to put on the record a statement for the record by Jennifer Settlemeyer, the Senior Director at March of Dimes, about the impact of consolidation on baby formula. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Contreras, I'd like to turn to you next, if that's all right. I'd like to start by asking you, how would you grade the FDA's response to the current baby formula shortage?
We were actually, really critical of their response. We do a lot of engagement with the FDA because of the nature of the work that we do with ensuring consumer product safety, ensuring access to safe drugs, and we do a lot of work to raise awareness of, for consumers of the dangers of purchasing counterfeit drugs online. And so when we were alerted about the situation and saw this, we wanted to make sure that we were fair and vocal, that, the FDA is likely, understaffed, under-resourced, and experiencing a lot. I know that many staff members at the FDA were already working, 2 and 3 job roles within the agency. So we've been asking a lot of them lately. And so I think that,
I know it takes a lot of work to destroy that many containers of European formula. I mean, that's got to be exhausting, right?
Well, to be fair, they were imported illegally. So now if again, like our organization, has the fraud.org platform, so we would, typically ask consumers to reply, because they're at risk, right? We don't know specifically
Are they
what quality mandates are there.
people who consume European formulas regulated heavily by European regulatory agencies, are they less or more at risk than those parents unable to procure formula as a result of the shortage?
Right, correct. So I'm not making a comment on that. What I'm saying is that it raises the risk of the potential of bad actors online that are selling to consumers, like, for example, these companies that they're sort of middlemen, right? Bringing the foreign infant formula to people, and consumers, want to have it and, should, but we want to raise awareness of that risk, that they should be aware that, this didn't go through FDA review, and you never can tell. And even with, a consumer product, where do they go for complaints of, adverse events from consuming a product that was contaminated? Right. So then who gets involved? So even if it does come in, then we have to have a process to track those, where do I complain to the company for the quality that I wasn't pleased with?
Do you have any thoughts on what we could do to reform the FDA to prevent this in the future? And in asking that, it makes me a little nervous even raising it, because I'm very reluctant, frankly, to give more money and any amount of deference to the same people who messed this up to begin with. I'm not sure what would lead us to believe that would lead to a better outcome next time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my only thought is that, right now food safety is really largely broken up into 3 areas, 3 different jurisdictions, right? CDC, USDA, FDA. And if we had potentially a single agency to oversee it, or a single office, dedicated to this, and I think that, yeah, it's fair. It's kind of, not a great argument, right, to say that we need to, provide more funding, but there just isn't enough capacity, I think, in the country. And we see this in the work that we do with our cannabis products and CBD products. That, we see Wild West marketplaces go on without, without the FDA just doesn't have the capacity to do the regulation it needs to do.
Yeah, I guess what I'm reacting to there is the fact that they do have the capacity to destroy European regulated formula at a time when there's a shortage. And they do have enough capacity and human resources to impose and enforce these regulations in a way that creates the shortage. It just makes me wonder about their judgment. Ms. Carney, in your expert opinion, is it really necessary for the FDA to treat infant formula for babies who are under 6 months differently than it does treat other food products? And what problems could this cause by doing it this way?
Thank you, Senator Lee. I think that we need to look at infant formula definitely as food. It's not medicine. It can be therapeutic, but the main thing I feel like what is needed at the FDA is for somebody to provide oversight that is qualified in food and nutrition with an expertise in that area, and not someone that knows medications and drugs. That's another whole issue. I don't know about any kind of problems if we, if we would change things, but I do know that somebody with an expertise in that area should be the one that has oversight over the products that we use. And, looking at European formulas, we don't know, the saying that they're safe, that's not science-based that I know of. I would like for someone with a food nutrition background to look at that and say, oh yeah, let's just import all the baby formulas in Europe or wherever they're coming from so that we have more supply. I'm a little hesitant to say that without somebody's oversight on those kinds of products.
Yeah, I understand the reluctance. I also understand that we're in the midst of a shortage that's significant, that poses nothing short of a medical emergency for many American babies and families. And it goes beyond that. I have to assume that this also spills over. There's some overlap between those companies that produce infant formula in the United States and those companies that produce medically necessary diet materials, such as that must be consumed by patients suffering from PKU. I can only imagine that this infant formula shortage must exacerbate that problem. And these medically necessary diets, even in the absence of a shortage like this, are estimated to cost in excess of 8 times what someone would pay for normal food. And so that has me worried as well. Mr. Lin, when government policies encourage market concentration, particularly market concentration on this scale, is there really much the market can do to fight it when government forces are creating the market concentration?
Markets don't fight concentration. People fight concentration, Senator. So if,
Sure,
yeah,
but it's
yeah.
but it's
So
people responding to market force.
well, I'd say that they're responding to market structures that are established by the government. I actually think there's a lot of agreement here among all of us as we see a real combination of. I mean, I think we fundamentally agree that these problems were caused by bad government regulation. I'm focusing on the overthrow of traditional anti-monopoly law by people within government 40 years ago. But I'm not saying that, the FDA has acted perfectly here or even wisely in most respects. But I think that we have an opportunity, all of us, to work together to deal with this problem and to deal with all of these problems together. It's like I held up that publication from 2002 before because, Senator Cruz was talking about just, the need, we have foresaw some of these problems. We foresee a lot more problems. We don't want to be back here talking about other crises similar to this. We can take the steps together to address this systemic problem that, as we see in just about every industrial system on which we depend.
Right. Does the WIC program encourage market concentration? And to the extent that it does, should states in their WIC offerings be allowed to pursue multi-source contracts rather than being limited as they currently are to sole source, single source contracts? So their supply chains aren't, dependent on a single producer?
Yes, no, and we strongly, as an organization, we strongly encourage the updating of procurement policy to promote competition. This is something that should be done at every level of government.
Thank you. Mr. Lincecum, if I'm not mistaken, Congress passed the law that created the WIC program back in 1972. You have any idea what the market formula looked like prior to that program's creation?
It was a much different market, as you can imagine, much smaller, but at the same time, there was a similar, not similar level, but there was some concentration as well back then. I think one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned before, is that we've been protecting the dairy market in the United States for going on a century now. There's not much of a free market in dairy and including in formula. But I think it is nice to see agreement. I was pleased to read Chair Klobuchar's letter to Secretary Vilsack also about WIC. I think we all understand that WIC is a problem in this case. Merits of the program itself, intention of the program itself aside, it is doing a lot of the driving the concentration, and a simple expansion of the kind of a voucherization of that would certainly help.
Right. Ms. Contreras, the Biden administration reports that it has secured commitments to bring in 127.5 million bottles of formula. How much of this commitment has physically arrived in the United States and has been made available to Americans for purchase in retail stores? Any idea?
Unfortunately, I don't. That's outside of my expertise.
Okay. Apparently that number is 1.5 million. Only 1.5 million of those bottles have been made available so far, and that's according to the information from the White House itself. Now, American babies consume more than 63 million bottles of formula per week. And so, based on that statistic, the number that we got from the White House, where the White House, the Biden administration has brought in 1.5 million bottles of formula, it seems to me that like we haven't even begun to address the formula shortage that we're facing. And according to recent reporting by Data Assembly, the United States is facing a 74% shortage nationwide. That means 47 million bottles of formula unavailable for American families every week, short of what we can provide. So the Biden administration hasn't even brought in enough formula to meet the needs of American families for even a single day. So we really need to open up the floodgates and to open up the floodgates to safe foreign-made formula so that American babies don't go hungry. The Formula Act does that. I still haven't heard a single substantive critique of it that would warrant not passing it, because every day that goes by without passing it, we prolong this shortage, a shortage that the White House really has not done anything but pay lip service toward resolving. This would resolve it. Ms. Carney, the European Union is the largest exporter of infant formula in the world. The formula produced there in the European Union is nutritionally similar to, and in some cases, according to a number of experts, qualitatively better than U.S. formula. If it's good enough for babies in the United Kingdom, in France, and Switzerland, why isn't it good enough for American babies? So I'd ask, who's at greater risk here? Is it the French baby drinking European formula or the American baby going hungry?
Thank you. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that exactly, but I will say as long as we can look at these formulas and they appear to us to be nutritionally sound and safe, I think that opening up the market is definitely something we need to do. We do have to focus. I appreciate what you said. We have a formula shortage every single day in this country, and we hear a lot of talk, but down in the weeds where I am working, we have mothers calling. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? And I think as long as they have some medical guidance, all formulas are not the same as far as nutritional content and components. The nutritional analysis can be different. For instance, in my testimony, I referred to preterm infants. There is preterm infant formula that meets the needs for preterm infants. There's also term formula. There's formula that meets the needs, for instance, the children with PKU or other genetic disorders. So we can't just willy-nilly just let formula be out there and mothers and babies picking their own formula. As long as there's some medical guidance to say, oh, this is a healthy term baby, you can get this formula, or your child has a genetic disorder, this is the kind of formula you need. Mothers and families and parents, they need guidance. So I don't have a problem with European formulas as long as we look at it and say this formula is for this population and this other formula is for another population.
And I assume it's fair to conclude that European regulators do in fact inspect European formula manufacturers.
I would assume so too. I don't know for sure, but surely they do if they're giving it to their infants in those countries.
Do you have, or are you aware of?
Yeah.
You're aware of any evidence suggesting that American babies would react differently to European formula than European babies do?
If the ingredients are comparable, I don't see why we would, expect babies to respond differently. I would want to see the nutrient composition, but no, I think that would be assumed.
Yeah, it makes sense to me then that given the similarities both in the structure and composition of European formulas, given the similarities in the way European formula manufacturers are regulated, and given the similarities between European babies, American babies, and all babies all over the world, everywhere, who have the same types of systems in place. They react to formula regardless of which continent they happen to have been born on. It would make
I will say
sense.
that we like our formulas to have iron in them. Most of our formulas have iron, a significant amount that meet the nutritional needs of babies. And some formulas are lower in calories. So, you know, it would just take some adjustments to utilize these
Sure.
formulas, but I think it could be done.
Adjustments are much better than going without. That's why it makes no sense to destroy European formula while American babies are going hungry. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. I was thinking about our Short on Competition Act that we did on prescription drugs a while back together that we introduced with the idea of importation when there's a shortage of drugs and some of the work that's gone in that area. And I think that's where I'm going to end. I'm just going to ask a few questions. It's been a long day here. Mr. Lynn, in your opinion, what can the FTC do to better police pharmaceutical mergers under the law? Because we've seen, to take this sort of out of the area of baby formula, since the hearing is about other forms of consolidation as well, it's been illustrative what we've seen in the pharma area. Would reforming the antitrust laws enable the FTC, or for that moment, the Justice Department, to do more to prevent anti-competitive drug company mergers?
Yes, I mean, it would, I think what the FTC should, the reforms in the law would make it easier for the FTC and other enforcers to ensure competition. And, but, you know, one thing one thing that the FTC should do, and our government more widely should do, is actually really integrate our domestic approach to competition with our international approach to competition. And I would remind, we were talking a lot here about imports, I would remind everybody here about what happened to the seasonal flu vaccine production capacity in 2004, when a single plant went down, was contaminated in Liverpool. And that United States that year was dependent on that plant for 1/2 of our seasonal flu vaccine production, 1/2. So this simply going to saying that importing is going to solve the problem is not true. Absent rules that establish a market that expects a certain number of players with a certain market share. And we have always done this from the past, and this is actually just answering your question. This is something that the FTC is actually looking at now with its guidelines, which is going back to strict structural, bright line rules on market structure.
Okay, thank you. One last question, since this bill is getting signed into law tomorrow. Mr. Lynn, we know that one of the issues with supply chains has been the shipping conglomerates, international shipping conglomerates that are charging 4 times the amount. This is one year to year, 20 to 21, 4 times the amount for containers that they did in the past, kind of using the pandemic as an excuse, which is translated into much bigger prices, of course, for American businesses, American farmers, and then that gets translated into higher prices for consumers. It's certainly by no means the only cause of increased prices, but it definitely is a contributing factor. That's why Senator Thune and I joined forces. I was pleased we got unanimous support for the bill to crack down on not just the pricing issues, but also the lack of willingness of some of these international conglomerates, of which there are only 4, 3 control most of the market, to even ship American goods at times. They, in fact, bring stuff in from other countries, fine, but then they are shipping out air because they're in such a hurry to get back to the other countries. This bill is important. President signing into law, Representative Garamendi and Johnson led it in the House. But I think beyond that, we also have to look at the antitrust implications of this industry and what is going on here and the potential of making a change there if, in fact, they don't bring the prices down. And I think our unanimous support in the Senate might just give them a little indication that what is to come if we don't see some change immediately, even before the rules take effect. Could you comment on what's happening there?
No, it's an enormously important issue. I mean, as you mentioned, these foreign-controlled steamship corporations are often exporting air rather than picking up American exports and moving them abroad. And I would actually add another factor, which is that these are corporations that are controlled by foreign mercantilist countries, Germany, China, and the fact that they're not picking up U.S. Exports is often a policy that is being imposed on them by the countries that actually control over them. But this is a problem. This is a first step. The law tomorrow is a first step, but we should remember that for most of American history, until the mid-1990s, we had American-flagged ships transiting the Pacific and the Atlantic. This goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Independence meant independence from other people's trading systems. And this is a case in which we may have to actually think about re-engaging and actually having a steamship industry that is American flagged in order to ensure that we have a seat at that table that allows us effectively to engage in the regulation of that industry.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I think we had a lot of good ideas here coming out of the hearing. I think you can see the passion that senators on both sides of the aisle bring to this issue, wanting to get solutions and fix this. And I will leave the record open for a week so that if there people have questions, additional questions, or people that couldn't make it, but we had great attendance. Once again, I thank Senator Lee for holding this hearing with me. Thank you. Hearing's adjourned.